The wind in the Wyoming Territory of 1887 was not merely a movement of air. It was a geologic force, a relentless sculptor of land and character. It found every crack, every weakness, every seam in the constructions of man, and worried them until they gave way. For Elara Vance, now in her second year of widowhood, the wind was a constant, keening reminder of the cabin's shortcomings. Her late husband, Anders, had built it hastily, a simple box of green timber meant to suffice for a season or two until a proper homestead could be raised. But a fever had taken him before the first snows of the previous winter, leaving Elara with the temporary structure as her only fortress against the coming cold, a fortress whose walls seemed to breathe the very chill they were meant to repel. Last winter had been a lesson in misery, a constant battle of feeding the stove only to feel the heat stolen away by the porous walls, the warmth lingering for mere minutes before the bitter cold seeped back in, coating the inside of the planks with a fine, cruel frost. This year, she decided, would be different. The townsfolk of Laramie Creek saw her actions as a peculiar form of grief-stricken madness. They watched as she, a woman alone with no man to guide her, began what looked like the systematic deconstruction of her own shelter, with autumn's chill already sharpening the air. She did not take an axe to the logs. Her method was more painstaking, more confusing to the casual eye. Using a crowbar and a heavy mallet, Elara carefully, methodically, began prying the interior planks from the cabin walls. She worked one small section at a time, her movements economical and precise, numbering each board with a piece of charcoal before stacking them in neat order on the dirt floor. To her neighbors, it was an act of profound foolishness. To Elara, it was the only logical step in a process she had spent the summer months rehearsing in her mind. A plan born from a memory of a different kind of life, a different kind of cold, and a man who understood the world not through the lens of prairie wisdom, but through the unforgiving logic of the sea. It was Hiram Poole, a man who had helped raise half the structures in the settlement and considered himself an authority on sound construction, who felt compelled to intervene. He strode over one afternoon, his face a mask of paternalistic concern, his shadow falling long across her work. "Mistress Vance," he began, his voice accustomed to being heated, "I don't mean to intrude on your private affairs, but a body has to ask what you're about here. Winter's not but a few weeks off. This is no time to be opening your walls to the elements." He gestured with a calloused hand at the exposed outer logs, where the dried mud chinking was now visible. "You're thinning your protection, woman. A thicker wall is a warmer wall. Every soul on this prairie knows that." His certainty was as solid and unyielding as the frozen ground would soon be. A wall of conventional wisdom she knew she could not easily breach. Elara paused, resting the crowbar against a stack of numbered planks. She looked at Hiram, a man whose kindness was genuine, but whose imagination was bounded by the things he had seen and built with his own two hands. She had expected this. She had, in fact, been waiting for it. "I am not thinning them, Mr. Poole," she said, her voice even and calm, carrying no hint of defiance, only fact. "I am preparing to make them stronger, not against an axe, but against the cold." From the corner of her eye, she saw Dorothea Weiss pausing her walk back from the general store, her curiosity a palpable thing across the dusty expanse. Dorothea's brand of concern was different from Hiram's. It was the kind that would be reported, embellished, and dissected over sewing circles and church steps, transforming Elara's peculiar project from a private endeavor into a public spectacle of a widow's folly. Amusement was a safer position than attempting to understand, and pity was easier than offering help for a task that made no sense. Hiram Poole squinted, his mind trying to reconcile her words with the evidence before him. He saw a wall made thinner, the delicate inner skin of the cabin peeled back to expose its rough skeleton. Stronger? He saw only a woman inviting the wolf of winter directly into her den. Stronger how? He pressed, his tone shifting from concern to faint exasperation. By taking them apart? That's like saying you'll stay dry by tearing holes in your roof. It defies sense. He was not a cruel man, but he was a practical one, and his world was governed by principles of mass and density. More wood meant more insulation. More chinking meant fewer drafts. These were the immutable laws of frontier survival as he understood them. What she was doing was not just unconventional, it was a negation of everything they knew to be true, a dangerous flirtation with disaster. He saw a tragedy in the making, and it frustrated him that she could not. Elara chose not to argue the point directly. Explaining the principle to him now, with his mind so firmly set, would be as futile as planting seeds in permafrost. Instead, she offered a simple, if cryptic, statement. The wall is not just a barrier, Mr. Poole. I intend to make it a reservoir. He simply shook his head, a slow, sad gesture that consigned her to the category of women made strange by loss. You mind that stove, Mistress Vance, he said, turning to leave. You'll be needing a mountain of wood to see you through if you carry on with this. The unspoken sentiment hung in the air between them. And you won't have it. He walked away, convinced he had done his neighborly duty, leaving Elara in the growing shadow of her own strange conviction, the whispers of the community already beginning to swirl like the first dust devils of a coming storm. Her conviction, however, was not born of prairie dust or high plains desperation. It was a legacy, a piece of quiet knowledge bequeathed to her by Anders. He had been a shipwright in his former life, a man raised on the Baltic coast where the winters were damp and penetrating, a cold that clung to the bones. He had built ships designed to cross the North Atlantic, and he understood that keeping a man warm in a storm-tossed sea was not about the thickness of the hull, but about what lay within it. Elara could still hear his voice, a low rumble like distant thunder, as they sat by their first fire in this very cabin, the wind shrieking outside. He had run a hand over the cold inner wall and shaken his head. "This is a landlubber's box," he had said, not with contempt, but with the diagnostic eye of a master craftsman. "It fights the wind, but it invites the cold. They don't understand." He had tried to explain it to her then, using the simple elements at hand. He had taken a stone from the hearth, still radiating a deep, penetrating heat, and a piece of kindling of the same size. The kindling was hot to the touch, but its heat was a fleeting, surface-level thing that vanished in moments. The stone, however, held its warmth for hours, a steady, patient release of energy. "Wood is a fine barrier," Anders had told her, his large hand cupping the warm stone. "It stops the wind. But it has no memory of heat. It cools almost as fast as it warms. But this," he said, tapping the stone, "this has mass. It holds the warmth. It stores it. On the ships, For the captain's quarters on the long voyages, we didn't just use thick timbers. Between the inner and outer hull, we would pack things. Sometimes wool, sometimes cork. But for true, deep cold, the old masters used sand. Dry, tightly packed sand. The principle was one of thermal mass. The community, in their practical wisdom, saw the wall as a shield. The thicker the shield, the better. Anders had seen it as a vessel. A shield could be breached, its integrity compromised by the sheer, relentless pressure of the cold. A vessel, however, could be filled. It could be charged with energy, with warmth from the stove, and then hold that energy, slowly releasing it back into the living space long after the fire had been banked for the night. "The sand doesn't make the heat, Elara," he had explained patiently, his finger tracing a line on the dusty floor. "It holds it. The fire warms the air. The warm air slowly warms the sand in the walls. By nightfall, you have a room surrounded by 100 stones from the hearth, all breathing warmth back at you. It makes the cold work harder. It makes every piece of wood you burn work 10 times as long." Watching an outcome, she had learned from him, was not the same as understanding the principle. Her neighbors saw only a thin wooden wall. She saw an empty container, waiting to be filled with the memory of fire. She had tried to explain this once, in the vaguest of terms, to Constance Hartwell, a woman whose gaze held more curiosity than judgment. "It's about holding the day's heat," Elara had said as they stood near the creek. Constance had nodded, but her expression remained politely blank. "Like a good thick quilt, you mean?" Elara knew then that the language of her idea was foreign here. The concepts were too abstract, too removed from the tangible, brute force solutions the frontier demanded. They understood quilts and logs and chinking. They did not understand thermal reservoirs and passive heat exchange. So she stopped trying to explain. The proof would not be in her words, but in the quiet, undeniable warmth of her home when the first blizzard descended. Her faith was not in magic, but in a principle as solid and reliable as the stone Anders had held in his hand. The work was arduous, a solitary pilgrimage of labor. Her first task was securing the medium itself. For 2 weeks, from sunup to sundown, Elara made the half-mile trek to the wide, sandy bend in Laramie Creek. She carried 2 heavy oaken buckets, their iron bands groaning with each step. She chose her collection spot carefully, scooping away the damp upper layer to get to the fine, dry sand beneath. Sand that had been bleached and purified by 1,000 summer suns. The weight of the full buckets stretched her arms and settled deep in the muscles of her back. Each return trip to the cabin was a slow, shuffling journey. Her focus narrowed to the next footstep, the burn in her shoulders a constant companion. She piled the sand on a large canvas tarp she had laid out near the cabin, a growing golden dune that shimmered in the crisp autumn light and caused further consternation among those who passed by. When the dune had grown to a size she deemed sufficient, a calculation based on her own careful measurements of the wall cavities, the true labor began. She started with the north wall, the one that bore the brunt of the winter wind. With the inner planks removed, the space between the studs was revealed, a hollow chamber some 4 inches deep. She took the first bucket and, standing on a small stool, began to pour. The sand cascaded down with a soft, hissing sigh, a sound that seemed to absorb the silence of the prairie. It filled the bottom of the cavity quickly, but pouring was not enough. She remembered Anders's insistence. "Tightly packed," he had said. "Air is the enemy. Air lets the cold travel." So, after every few buckets, she took up a long, thin pole, a piece of smoothed cottonwood, and began tamping. The process was rhythmic, almost meditative. Pour, hiss, thump. Pour, hiss, thump. The sound of the tamping changed as the sand compacted, the initial hollow echo giving way to a dense, solid thud. It was a sound of substance, of permanence. She worked her way up the wall, section by section, feeling with her fingers to ensure the sand was packed tight against the outer logs, filling every void, every knotty imperfection. The dust got in her hair, in her throat, on her skin, a fine, gritty film that covered everything. But as she worked, she felt the character of the wall changing under her hands. It was no longer a thin, resonant shell that vibrated with every gust of wind. It was becoming inert, solid, a monolithic slab of earth and wood. When she finally finished a section and nailed the numbered inner planks back into place, the change was profound. Knocking on the wall now produced not a hollow boom, but a dull, satisfying thud, like knocking on a slab of rock. She repeated the process for the west wall, then the east, and finally the south. Each day she grew more tired, her body aching with a fatigue so deep it settled in her bones. Yet, with each completed section, a quiet, fierce determination grew within her. She was not merely filling a space with sand. She was building her fortress, stone by patient stone. She was honoring the memory of her husband not with tears, but with the practical application of his wisdom. The townsfolk's pity and skepticism became a distant hum, a meaningless noise beyond the focused world of her labor. The scrape of the shovel, the hiss of the sand, the solid thud of the tamping rod. She was too busy, too invested in the process, to be troubled by the opinions of those who could not see beyond the surface of things. The cabin was being transformed from the inside out, its very nature shifting from a hollow box to a solid vessel, and only she could feel the truth of it. The first true test did not announce itself with subtlety. It arrived in late November as a bruised, purple stain on the northwestern horizon, a stain that spread and darkened with unnatural speed. The wind, which had been a constant but manageable presence, fell eerily silent. The air grew heavy, static, and preternaturally cold. The old-timers saw the signs and knew. This was not a mere squall or a flurry of snow. This was the first great blizzard of the season, the kind that could last for days and leave the world buried and silent in its wake. Lights in the settlement were extinguished early as families made their final preparations, securing livestock and piling wood high inside their homes. A sense of collective hunkering down settled over Laramie Creek. For Elara, this was the moment the entire autumn had been building toward. There was no more preparation to be done. Her work was finished. Now, all she could do was wait and trust in the principle. As the first flakes of snow began to drift down, thick and heavy as goose feathers, she secured the heavy bar across her door and checked the window shutters. The silence outside was profound, a world holding its breath. Then, with a low moan that grew into a deafening shriek, the wind returned and the storm began in earnest. In the previous winter, a storm like this would have been an immediate and terrifying assault on the cabin. The walls would have groaned, the wind would have screamed through a dozen invisible cracks, and the cold would have descended like a physical weight. She would have built a roaring, desperate fire in the stove, a fire that consumed wood at an alarming rate, fighting a losing battle against the invasive chill. She would have spent the night huddled in blankets, feeding the hungry iron box, knowing that the moment she let the flames die down, the frost would creep across the floor toward her. Tonight, she did something different. She built a small, modest fire, just enough to keep a kettle simmering and to cast a warm, steady glow across the room. She did not feed it frantically. She added a log only when the embers began to fade, maintaining a consistent, moderate heat. This was the crucible of her faith in Anders's knowledge. Her task was not to fight the storm head-on with a massive fire, but to gently and consistently charge the reservoir she had so painstakingly built. She was tending the system, not battling the elements. The wind hammered at the north wall, a physical, percussive force. Last year, that sound would have been accompanied by a corresponding drop in temperature, the wood of the wall itself becoming a conduit for the external cold. But now, the sound was muffled, distant. The wall stood inert, its newfound mass absorbing the fury of the wind, the vibrations dying within the tightly packed sand. Hours passed. The storm raged, a white chaos that erased the world outside her window. Inside, a strange and wonderful stillness reigned. Elara sat in her simple wooden chair, mending a shirt, the light from her small fire unwavering. There were no drafts tickling the back of her neck. The air, which in the past would have been stratified, scorching near the stove and frigid a few feet away, was now remarkably even. A slow, gentle circulation of warmth filled the single room. She walked to the north wall, the epicenter of the storm's assault, and pressed her palm flat against an inner plank. She closed her eyes, concentrating on the sensation. It was not warm, not like the hearthstone Anders had held, but crucially, it was not cold. It was not the biting, soul-leeching cold of a thin barrier failing against a Wyoming blizzard. It was neutral. It felt solid, dense, and utterly indifferent to the tempest on its other side. The wall was holding. The sensory proof was subtle, yet absolute. It was in the way the air felt on her skin, a gentle, uniform warmth that had no precedent in her memory of this place. It was in the quietness of the room. The storm's roar diminished to a deep, resonant hum rather than a terrifying shriek. It was in the slow, even consumption of her firewood. She had been awake for hours, and the small pile she had brought inside was still mostly intact. Last year, that pile would have been gone by midnight. She made herself a cup of tea and held the warm mug in her hands. But the comfort it offered was secondary to the greater comfort that surrounded her. The cabin itself felt like a warm stone held in the hand of a blizzard. It had become the vessel Anders had described, and it was filled with the steady, quiet memory of her small fire. In that moment, she felt a profound connection to her late husband, a sense of his presence that was more real than any ghost. It was the presence of his mind, his logic, his deep understanding of the physical world. He had left her not just a memory of love, but a tool for survival, a principle she had grasped and made manifest with her own hands. This quiet, unassailable warmth was his final gift. The skepticism of Hiram Poole, the pitying glances of Dorothea Weiss, they all dissolved into irrelevance. Their opinions were based on a world of thin walls and roaring fires. She now inhabited a different reality, one governed by a more elegant and efficient truth. She had not conquered the winter, for that was impossible. Instead, she had learned its language and used its own principles against it. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a functioning system, and she was its quiet, confident operator. A small, triumphant smile touched her lips in the firelight. She had been right. The blizzard lasted for 3 days. For 3 days, the world vanished into a churning vortex of wind and snow. The settlement of Laramie Creek was effectively paralyzed, each family an isolated island in a sea of white. Inside his well-built, double-logged cabin, Hiram Poole found himself in a state of constant, exhausting labor. His home, the pride of his craft, was a leaky fortress. The wind, driven to a razor's edge, forced its way through infinitesimal gaps in the chinking, and the sheer conductive power of the cold leached warmth from the massive logs. He had to keep his great stone fireplace roaring, a dragon consuming split pine at a terrifying pace. He watched his carefully stacked winter woodpile dwindle with growing alarm. He thought often, and with a grim sense of pity, of the Vance widow in her flimsy, sabotaged cabin. He imagined her frozen, her fire long since extinguished, and felt a pang of guilt for not having intervened more forcefully. On the morning of the 4th day, the world was born anew. The wind had died, leaving behind a profound, crystalline silence. The sun rose on a landscape of impossible beauty and stark reality, a world buried under 4 feet of smooth, sculpted snow. Hiram's first priority was to check on his neighbors. He bundled himself in heavy wool and leather and began the arduous task of digging a path from his door. His destination was Elara Vance's cabin. He expected the worst, a chimney with no smoke, a silence that spoke of tragedy. As he drew closer, wading through waist-deep drifts, he saw it. A thin, impossibly lazy curl of blue smoke rising from her stovepipe into the still, frigid air. It was not the thick, desperate plume of a fire being frantically revived, but the calm, steady breath of a fire that had never been in any danger of going out. He reached her door and knocked, the sound unnaturally loud in the muffled world. When the door swung open, he was met not with the blast of frigid, stale air he had anticipated, but with a gentle wave of simple, clean warmth. It was not the oppressive, dry heat of an overstoked stove, but a comfortable, ambient heat that seemed to emanate from the very structure itself. Elara stood there, looking tired but calm, a shawl draped loosely over her shoulders. Hiram was momentarily speechless. He stared past her into the cabin, a space he had expected to be an icebox, and saw a scene of placid domesticity. There was no frost on the walls. She was not huddled in a mountain of blankets. A small kettle steamed gently on the stove. His own cabin, for all its thick logs, was already beginning to feel the deep chill of a banked fire. This place felt like a mild autumn afternoon. "Mistress Vance," he finally managed, his breath pluming in the doorway. "You are... well?" It was a foolish question, the answer obvious. "I am, Mr. Poole. Thank you for checking," she replied, her voice calm and even. He stepped inside, compelled by a need to understand the phenomenon he was experiencing. The warmth was uniform. It was uncanny. He ran a hand over his face, his mind struggling to process the sensory data that contradicted a lifetime of experience. He looked at her small, neatly stacked woodpile. It was barely diminished. His own was nearly gone. He walked unbidden to the north wall and placed his hand upon it, just as Elara had done days before. He felt the same thing, the complete absence of cold. The wall was a neutral barrier, a solid mass that held no chill. He turned to her, his expression a mixture of awe and utter confusion. "How?" he asked, the single word encompassing a dozen questions. "The walls," she said simply. "They hold the heat, the sand." Later that day, after Hiram had returned to his own chilly home, his mind reordering itself around a new and powerful idea, Constance Hartwell made her way over. She had watched Hiram's visit from her window, had seen the look on his face as he left. She brought a small loaf of bread, a neighborly offering that was also an excuse to satisfy her own quiet curiosity. Unlike Hiram, she did not ask how with a sense of disbelief, but with a genuine desire to learn. Elara invited her in, and as they shared tea in the comfortable warmth, she explained the principle properly. She told Constance about Anders, about the ships, about the stone from the hearth and the memory of heat. Constance listened, her intelligent eyes fixed on Elara's face, and when the explanation was done, she nodded slowly. "My grandmother used to bury potatoes in a sand pit in the cellar," she said, making a connection. "She said the earth kept the frost away. It's the same thing, isn't it? Just in the walls." In that moment, the knowledge passed from one woman to another. No longer a widow's strange secret, but the beginning of a new kind of local wisdom. The story of Elara Vance's warm cabin spread through Laramie Creek, not with the speed of gossip, but with the slow, steady creep of undeniable fact. As winter tightened its grip, the difference between her home and the others became a matter of public record. Her chimney puffed its lazy smoke, while others belched desperate clouds. She was never short on firewood. Travelers caught in sudden squalls who sheltered with her spoke of the strange, bone-deep warmth of the place. Hiram Poole, humbled and pragmatic, was the first to ask for her help. That spring, before the thaw was even complete, he came to her, hat in hand, and asked if she would show him how to fill his own walls with sand. He did not ask for her to do the work, only to share the knowledge. She did so, freely and without any hint of triumph. She showed him how to pry the boards, how to tamp the sand, how to listen for the change in sound from hollow to solid. He, in turn, with his reputation as a builder, gave the method a stamp of legitimacy it had previously lacked. The technique, which became known as a Vance wall, was not adopted by everyone at once. There were still traditionalists who trusted only in the thickness of their logs. But as the years passed, new cabins were built with the 4-inch cavity as a matter of course, and existing ones were retrofitted. The brutal Wyoming winters were not tamed, but they were made more bearable, more survivable. The amount of labor required to cut and haul firewood each autumn was reduced, freeing up time and energy for other vital tasks. Elara Vance's cabin stood for more than 50 years, a testament to an idea that had been born on a distant sea and found its purpose on the high, windy plains. Children who grew up in the sand-filled houses took for granted the quiet, steady warmth of their homes, unaware of the time when winter meant a constant, losing battle against the cold. The innovation, born of one woman's memory, grief, and quiet determination, had become the community's shared inheritance, a legacy as solid and enduring as the packed earth within their walls.